I put the paper aside and glanced at the clock again. It was 15 to 4. The phone had been silent all day and I'd almost convinced myself that she wouldn't call. Ottilia always called on Sunday afternoons, and if the phone was silent by 3 o'clock, I could consider myself pardoned this week. At 65, I had already learned to appreciate such small respites. Every conversation with my only daughter turned into an elaborate torture, where she skillfully juggled guilt, recriminations, and subtle but painful jabs at my most vulnerable places. The kettle on the stove whistled, and I rose from my chair, feeling my knee crunch. My old house in Wheaton was as shabby as I was. Creaky floorboards, peeling paint on the windowsills, stained wallpaper. It spoke of a slow but inevitable fading. When Lorraine had been alive, these walls had been clean and orderly. She had a way of adding meaning and beauty to a space, turning a modest postal worker's dwelling into a home. After her death 7 years ago, I never really learned to take care of the house or myself. The phone rang as I was making tea. The sharp trill cut through the silence, and my hand shook, spilling the boiling water over the countertop. I knew who was calling without even looking at the screen. "Hello, Ottilia," I said, trying to give my voice a nonchalance I didn't feel. "Were you asleep?" Her voice was immediately reproachful. "It's almost 4, Dad." "No, I was just making tea. How are things with you and Hamish?" I always asked about my son-in-law, though every mention of his name made me vaguely irritated. Hamish Birdwhistle was 10 years older than my daughter, a pompous and self-righteous type who worked in Wheaton's city government. In their 15 years of marriage, I'd never been able to sympathize with him. "We're doing just fine, unlike some people," Ottilia replied. "I'm calling to invite you to dinner on Thursday, 6 o'clock. Hamish insists. The news took me by surprise. Ottilia usually limited herself to formal Sunday calls and occasional visits for special occasions. A sudden invitation to dinner on a weekday didn't fit the usual script of our relationship. "Thursday?" I asked, feverishly going over possible reasons in my mind. "Was it someone's birthday? An anniversary?" "No, just dinner." The irritation in her voice was growing. "Do we need a special occasion to invite you?" The answer was obvious. Yes, they usually needed an occasion. In the last few years, I couldn't remember a time when Ottilia had asked me out for no reason at all. "Of course not," I lied. "Just clarifying. I'll think about it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, I'll think about it?" Ottilia asked coldly. "What's there to think about? I knew what I was doing." Whenever my daughter wanted something from me, I tried not to agree right away. It was my little way of maintaining some illusion of control in our relationship. If I said yes right away, she would only assert her power over me. "I might have plans," I replied, knowing it sounded lame. Ottilia snorted. "What plans could you possibly have? Sit in a chair and watch old movies? Or maybe you finally decided to accept Mrs. Campbell's invitation to tea." My cheeks flushed. Lillian Campbell, the widow who lived 2 streets away from me, had indeed invited me to tea several times, and I had always declined. Not because I didn't like her. It was just that after Lorraine, I couldn't imagine myself with another woman. And for Ottilia to use that against me was low even by her standards. "How come?" "It's not that," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just not used to getting dinner invitations in the middle of the week, especially not from you. Usually we only see each other on special occasions." "Hamish has something important to discuss with you," Ottilia finally admitted. "It concerns your house, that's it." Now everything was falling into place. For the past few months, Ottilia had been hinting that I should sell the old house and move into a nursing home or a small apartment. "It's too hard for you to keep such a big house in order, Daddy," she'd said with feigned concern. In fact, I knew that she and Hamish had had their eye on my property for a long time. The house was old, but it stood on a nice piece of land in downtown Wheaton that was becoming more attractive to developers every year. "And what exactly did he want to discuss?" I asked, feeling the resistance building up inside. "You'll find out on Thursday," Ottilia cut me off. "Are you coming or not?" I could have said no. I should have said no. But some part of me still clung to the hope of connecting with my only daughter, even though I knew it was probably a waste of emotion. "Okay, I'll be there," I gave in. 6 o'clock, you said?" "Yes," she said, a softer tone in her voice. "Just please don't wear that awful brown jacket. It looks like you found it at a charity sale." I looked at my favorite jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Lorraine had given it to me for our last New Year's Eve together. I'd worn it on special occasions, cherished it like the apple of my eye, though the fabric on the elbows had frayed a little over the years. Okay, I lied. Can I get you anything? I don't need anything, she cut me off. Just show up on time and… Ottilia hesitated, as if restraining herself. Try to look decent. I made no response to that barb. In the years since Lorraine's death, I'd learned to let most of my daughter's barbs pass my ears. It was easier than trying to defend myself or, God forbid, fight back. The latter invariably led to protracted conflicts, after which Ottilia might not speak to me for months. I'll see you Thursday, I said and hung up before she could add anything else. I returned to my cooled tea, pondering this unexpected invitation. Something was not right here. Ottilia Birdwhistle, born Fernsby, never did anything for nothing. In her every gesture, in her every word, there was always a scrupulously calculated intent. Selling the house was a possible explanation, but something told me it was more than that. There was a new note in my daughter's voice, as well as the usual demanding tone. Worry? Insecurity? It was so unlike my always self-assured Ottilie. I sighed and rubbed my temples. I always got a headache after talking to my daughter. When did she turn into this cold, prickly woman? As a child, Ottilia had been a sunny child, with an infectious laugh and an open heart. Lorraine and I doted on her, indulging her every whim and encouraging her every endeavor. The turning point came in adolescence when her peers began teasing her for her unusual name. Lorraine insisted on the name Ottilia, in honor of her grandmother, without thinking what a target for ridicule it might become in a small country town like Wheaton. My daughter began to blame us for this, became withdrawn, and then as if her heart had frozen, meeting Hamish at the age of 27 changed her completely. He was an aspiring politician, ambitious and determined. Ottilia, who worked as a music teacher at the local school, saw in him a ticket to a better life, an opportunity to rise above the provincial routine. She fell in love not so much with him as with his prospects and social status. Lorraine immediately disliked Hamish. There's something slippery about him. Unreliable, she said. Don't trust him, Alistair. I tried to follow my wife's advice, but after her death, Hamish suddenly began to show me ostentatious concern. He called, inquired about my health, even invited me fishing a few times. Ottilia was delighted with this change, and I, wanting to mend relations with my only daughter, began to succumb to his charms. But lately I began to have doubts again. In rare meetings I noticed in my son-in-law some nervousness, uncharacteristic of his usual self-confident behavior. He often went off for phone conversations, talking quietly, looking around. And a couple of months ago, I overheard two men in a local pub mentioning Hamish in the context of some dubious dealings with Cityland. I hadn't given it much thought at the time, writing it off as the usual small-town gossip, where everyone knows everyone else and likes to wash the bones of local officials. But now, having received this strange invitation, I involuntarily remembered that conversation. The days until Thursday stretched slowly. I continued my measured life as a pensioner. I got up at 7, ate breakfast, read the newspaper, walked in the park, sometimes went to the library where I volunteered twice a week, shelving books. In the evenings, I watched old movies that Lorraine and I had once loved, or read detectives, the only genre that could still hold my attention. On Wednesday, the day before dinner, I came across a familiar face while shopping at the local supermarket. Denby Miracle, an old friend from my high school days, was studying the label on a can of canned beans as if the fate of the world depended on it. "Denby!" I called out to him, feeling genuinely happy to see him. He turned and his thin face broke into a smile. "Alistair Fernsby, you old devil." Denby clapped me on the shoulder with such force that I almost dropped the grocery basket. "Haven't seen you in ages. How you doing?" "Slowly," I replied, smiling back. "Are you still in the prosecutor's office?" Denby nodded. "I'm 2 years away from retirement. I can't wait, to tell you the truth. There's more and more work and less brains." We laughed, and I felt the tension of the last few days let go a little. Denby was one of the few people I could be myself with, without masks or pretense. We'd been friends since first grade in high school, And we'd been through teenage ups and downs. First love, disappointments. Then life divorced us. I went to work at the post office, and Denby studied law and made a good career in the city prosecutor's office. We didn't see each other often, but each meeting was a breath of fresh air. "How's Attilia?" Hulnam, Denby asked when we left the store. "Still tough on her, old man?" I smiled. Denby always had a way of calling things by their proper names. "Still the same," I admitted. "I'm going to their house for dinner tomorrow. They say Hamish has something important to discuss." Denby's face changed slightly at the mention of my son-in-law. Not a frown, but a stiffening, a concentration. "Hamish Birdwhistle," he said thoughtfully. "An interesting man." Something in the tone of his voice made me wary. "Do you know something about him that I don't?" I asked him directly. Denby glanced around as if checking for ears, then came closer. "Look, Alistair, I can't talk about work, but be careful with this man. Don't sign any papers without consulting a lawyer. And you better keep your opinions to yourself no matter what he suggests." My heart is beating faster. "Denby, you're scaring me. What are you talking about?" My friend put a hand on my shoulder. "Just be careful, okay? And if anything seems strange or suspicious, call me. Anytime." With that, he shook my hand firmly, nodded, and walked quickly away, leaving me with a bag of groceries and an oppressive sense of unease. When I got home, it took me a long time to calm down. Denby's words wouldn't leave my mind. What did he mean? What exactly did he know about my son-in-law? I went over everything I knew about Hamish Birdwhistle. On the surface, it all looked good. Son of wealthy parents, well-educated, stable career in city administration. He knew how to impress, was eloquent, charming when he wanted to be. Many in Wheaton considered him a rising star in local politics, a future of great promise. But there was something about him that always made me vaguely uneasy. Maybe an overly perfect facade that hid what? I couldn't put my suspicions into concrete thoughts, but after my conversation with Denby, they intensified many times over. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, listening to the creaks of the old house, to the noise of the rare cars on the street. My mind kept returning to the dinner to come and to what Hamish wanted to discuss with me. The sale of the house? Perhaps. But after what Denby had said, I began to suspect that it might be something more serious and perhaps not entirely legal. What if Hamish wanted to involve me in some kind of scam of his own? Use my name or property in some shady dealings? The thought was unpleasant, but not impossible. I knew of instances where unscrupulous businessmen had used elderly people, especially lonely ones, in their scams. But Hamish wasn't just any crook. He was my daughter's husband. Could he really be plotting something against me? And if so, did Ottilia know about it? The thought was even more painful. Despite all our differences, despite all the coldness of our relationship, I could not believe that my daughter would knowingly participate in something that could hurt me. To hurt with words, yes, but to do actual harm? No, she wasn't capable of that. At least that's what I wanted to believe. At some point, I decided I wasn't going to that dinner. I'd call in the morning, say I was sick or had an emergency, but with the first rays of sunshine came the realization that running away wouldn't solve the problem. If Hamish was really up to something, my refusal would only delay the inevitable. Better to face it, find out what it was, and be on my guard, as Denby had advised. Besides, somewhere deep inside, I had a hope that I was wrong, that all my suspicions were just the imagination of an old man who spent too much time alone. Maybe Hamish really just wanted to talk about selling the house or some other harmless matter. And Denby's warning, well, maybe my friend was just being overly cautious. With these thoughts, I faced Thursday morning, the day that would bring answers to all my questions, but which I dreaded in advance. The premonition of something wrong never left me for a moment, like a pesky fly that could not be swatted away. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, tentatively adjusting my tie. The brown jacket with the worn elbows fit me as well as the day Lorraine had given it to me. Against Ottilia's request, I'd chosen to wear it, a silent protest against her constant attempts to control every aspect of my life, even something as insignificant as my choice of clothes. A light drizzle drizzled outside the window. It was typical Wheaton weather for this time of year, gray, dank, melancholy. I took an umbrella but decided to call a cab rather than walk as I had originally planned. My old rheumatism reminded me of itself every time the weather changed, and the last thing I wanted was to show up at my daughter's house not only in an inappropriate jacket, but also limping with joint pain. The cab pulled up at 5:30 sharp. The young driver with a fashionable beard turned out to be surprisingly talkative, and all the way told me about his plans to move to London, where life is real, unlike in this hole. I nodded politely, thinking that when I was his age, I too dreamed of the big city, of adventure, of something more than life in provincial Wheaton. But then I met Lorraine, and all my ambitions centered on providing her and our future daughter with a quiet, stable life. "Here we are, sir." The cabbie's voice snapped me out of my reverie. I paid, leaving a generous tip, and stepped out into the drizzling rain. The Birdwhistle house loomed in front of me, 2 stories high, with perfectly trimmed bushes and an immaculate lawn. A warm light burned in the windows, giving the illusion of coziness and hospitality, an illusion I knew all too well. Taking a deep breath, I walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. Ottilia opened, and her gaze fell momentarily on my jacket. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything. Apparently, she'd decided not to start a conflict on the doorstep. "Daddy," she said instead of greeting, stepping aside, "you're just in time." She sounded mildly surprised, as if my punctuality were something unusual, though I'd never been late for a meeting with her in my entire life. "Son, hello, Ottilia." I leaned over to kiss my daughter on the cheek, but she deftly dodged, pretending to fix her hair. "Come in. Hamish is in the living room." I followed her down the hall, noting, as always, the perfect order of the house. Not a speck of dust, not a single thing out of place. Even the family photos on the walls were hung with mathematical precision, all the same distance apart. It was another trait I never realized in my daughter. This almost morbid craving for perfection, for control over her surroundings. Hamish met me with a strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked tense, even a little twitchy, which was quite unlike his usual self-assured demeanor. "Alistair," he exclaimed with exaggerated cheerfulness, "it's good to see you. How did you get here?" "By cab." I shook his hand, noting that his palm was damp with sweat. The weather wasn't conducive to hiking. Yes, yes, of course," Hamish nodded, glancing at his watch. "Would you like a drink? Whiskey? Brandy?" "Brandy, please," I agreed, though I usually preferred light wine or no wine at all. But tonight I thought I might need a stiff drink. While Hamish fiddled with the bar, I sat back in my chair and looked around. The living room, like the rest of the house, was a model of impeccable, taste-expensive furniture, elegantly framed pictures, crystal vases of fresh flowers. Everything spoke of wealth and position in society, which Ottilia valued so much. On the coffee table, I noticed a stack of papers partially covered by a newspaper. The headline on the top sheet caught my eye: "Deed of Transfer of Title." Hamish, noticing the direction of my gaze, hurried over and covered the documents with the paper completely, as if inadvertently. "Working papers," he explained with a nervous smile. "Nothing interesting, I assure you." He held out a glass of brandy to me, and I noticed his hand trembling slightly. Something was definitely wrong. Hamish always exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Seeing him so nervous, almost frightened, was strange and unsettling. Ottilia appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her spotless white apron. "Dinner is almost ready," she announced. 10 more minutes." She sat down across from me, hands folded in her lap, and smiled strainedly. "How are you doing, Dad? Still working at the library?" "Yes, twice a week." I sipped my brandy, feeling the liquid burn my throat. "I like being useful." "You need more rest at your age," Ottilia said, a familiar note of condescension slipping into her voice. "You're not young anymore." 65 isn't that old, my dear," I objected gently. "A lot of people my age are still working full-time." "Many, but not all," she cut me off. "And besides, you've always been fragile." That wasn't true, and Ottilia knew it well. I had never missed a day of work due to illness before I retired, and I had always been active and energetic. But in her eyes, I had always been weak, a failure who couldn't provide the family with the standard of living her mother dreamed of. Hamish cleared his throat, clearly feeling the tension building. "Alistair, I wanted to talk to you about a case," he began, but at that moment his phone rang. He flinched, pulled the device out of his pocket and looked at the screen. His face was visibly pale. "Excuse me, I have to take this," he mumbled and quickly left the room. Ottilia gave her husband an annoyed look, then turned to me. "He hasn't been himself lately," she said with a note of concern in her voice. "Always on the phone, working late, hardly sleeping at all." "Problems at work?" I asked cautiously, mindful of Denby's warning. Ottilia shrugged. "He says no, but I can tell he's hiding something." She lowered her voice. "You know, a couple weeks ago I found some strange documents in his office. Something to do with land near the old market. When I asked, he got angry, yelled at me. First time in all our years of marriage. That confession surprised me. Ottilia had never discussed her marital problems with me, always creating the illusion of a perfect relationship with her husband. "You didn't think that Hamish might be involved in something illegal?" Ottilia's eyes went wide, then narrowed. "What are you saying? Hamish is a respected man in this town. How can you even suggest some—" "I'm sorry," I said hastily, regretting that I'd even brought it up. "I'm just worried about you." "You don't have to worry about us," she cut me off. "You need to think about you, how you're going to live in that crumbling house." So that's what she was getting at. It was back to selling my house again. "My house is fine," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Yes, it's old, but it's solid, and I'm comfortable there." "Sutton, comfortable?" Ottilia snorted. "Daddy, the roof leaks, the floorboards creak, and the heating goes bad every winter. That's not comfort, that's stubbornness. You cling to the past instead of looking to the future." "What about the future?" I asked quietly. "A nursing home? A tiny apartment somewhere on the outskirts of town where you'll visit once a month out of a sense of duty?" Ottilia's face flashed with anger. "You're always like this, dramatizing, turning my words inside out. I just want you to live under normal conditions, not among memories. Memories." She said the last word with such contempt, as if memories were something shameful, dirty. For me, they were my only connection to Lorraine, to that happy time when we were a real family. Our conversation was interrupted by Hamish returning. He looked even more worried than before, sweat beading on his forehead. "Is everything all right?" Ottilia asked, giving her husband a suspicious look. "Yes, just work call," he answered, not looking her in the eye. "Is dinner ready? I'm starving." Ottilia glared at him for a second, then stood up. "Yes, we can go to the table." We went into the dining room where dinner was served. As always, the setting was impeccable: crystal glasses, silverware, snow-white tablecloths. Ottilia always paid great attention to detail, especially when it came to hosting guests, even if that guest was just her father. Hamish sat at the head of the table, and I took the seat across from Ottilia. There was an awkward silence between us, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. Hamish hardly ate, only occasionally bringing his fork to his mouth, but moving the food around more. His gaze kept darting to the windows, as if he expected to see something or someone there. The tension at the table was building by the minute. Hamish continued to fidget nervously in his chair, his fork scraping against the plate, making an unpleasant metallic sound that made my teeth chatter. Ottilia, usually so talkative in her husband's presence, sat silent, only occasionally casting concerned glances at him. I felt that I was caught up in some family drama, the details of which I did not know. "Great turkey, Ottilia," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Very juicy." My daughter nodded, smiling weakly. "Thank you, Daddy. I used Mom's recipe." This mention of Lorraine was unusual. Ottilia rarely spoke of her mother, as if trying to push her out of her memory. Perhaps in today's situation, she was instinctively looking for something familiar and reliable. "Lorraine was a master of the turkey," I encouraged the conversation. "I remember how she always insisted on marinating the bird the day before cooking." "Yes," Ottilia's eyes flashed with something like warmth. "Emma, and she always added thyme and rosemary from our garden." I nodded, remembering the little garden behind our house where Lorraine grew herbs and some vegetables. She was not only a great cook, but also a talented gardener, able to find an approach to the most capricious plants. Ottilia often helped her mother in the garden as a child, and it was rare moments when I saw them truly happy together, without the eternal tension that somehow always existed between them. Hamish, who hadn't participated in our conversation, suddenly rose from the table. Excuse me, I need to, check something in the study, he mumbled and quickly left the room. Ottilia gave him a look of obvious irritation. He hasn't been himself for the last 2 weeks, she said quietly, leaning toward me. Always on the phone, always in some kind of paperwork. I've tried to ask him what's going on, but he dismisses it as work stress. I took a sip of water from my glass, considering how frank I should be with my daughter. Ottilia, I began cautiously, are you sure Hamish isn't involved in some shady business? Her face closed instantly, her lips pressed into a thin line. What do you mean? Those documents he hid in such a hurry, his nervousness, those mysterious phone calls. I hesitated for words. It doesn't seem very normal. Akidiu. He's working on an important project, Ottilia cut in, but her voice wasn't as confident as before. The city administration has a lot on their plate right now with this renovation of the center. And how legitimate is that business? I asked bluntly. Ottilia abruptly pushed her plate away. Are you implying that my husband is a criminal? There was steel in her voice. Hamish is a respectable man. He would never do anything illegal. I raised my hands in a conciliatory gesture. I'm just worried about both of you, Ottilia. If Hamish is really just overworked, then I'm happy for him. But if there's something else, I didn't finish the sentence, so I let her figure it out for herself. My daughter opened her mouth to object, but at that moment my phone vibrated in my pocket. I usually turned it off before important meetings, but today, mindful of Denby's warning, I left it on. I'm sorry, I said to Ottilia, pulling out my phone. It could be important. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Leave now. Don't say anything to her. I felt the blood rush from my face. My first thought was that the message had been sent by Denby. Who else would warn me about something in that tone of voice? But it wasn't his number, and in fact, the number looked strange, with some unusual area code. Is something wrong? Ottilia's voice came to me as if from far away. You looked pale. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, trying to keep my expression calm. No, it's nothing serious, I lied. Just a message from a colleague at the library. There was a little problem with the cataloging. Ottilia didn't look convinced, but thankfully she didn't ask. At that moment, Hamish returned, and I involuntarily flinched at his appearance. Now that I had the phone in my pocket with this strange warning, I looked at my son-in-law with very different eyes. What was he hiding? How serious was his business? And most importantly, why was someone warning me of danger? Hamish sat back down at the table. His movements were abrupt, unnatural. He cast a quick glance at me, and I thought there was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Are you all right, Alistair? He asked, tilting his head. You look worried. I'm fine. I forced myself to smile. Just a little trouble in the library, nothing serious. The library? Hamish raised an eyebrow. At 6 o'clock at night? We're getting ready for a children's matinee, I improvised on the fly. The whole class is coming for a field trip tomorrow, and it turns out some of the books weren't put back after the last inventory. It sounded clumsy, even to me, but Hamish seemed satisfied with it, or pretended to be satisfied. He went back to his food, but I noticed that he was watching me more closely now, as if trying to figure something out. Ottilia, sensing the growing tension, tried to reopen the conversation. Papa, you haven't told me how Mrs. Campbell is doing. Is she still inviting you to tea? I nodded, trying to concentrate on the conversation, although all my thoughts were occupied with that mysterious message. Yes, she's very persistent, I answered absent-mindedly. But I'm not a big fan of tea parties. You should accept her invitation, Ottilia said with a strained smile. She's a nice woman, and after all, you shouldn't be alone all the time. I knew my daughter didn't really care much about my personal life. Rather, she was worried that the neighbors might gossip about her strange, reclusive father, which could cast a shadow on the impeccable reputation of the Birdwhistle family. Hamish suddenly pushed his chair back abruptly and stood up. Ottilia, may I speak to you for a moment? His voice sounded strained. Into the kitchen. My daughter gave him a surprised look, but obediently got up and followed her husband. Left alone, I immediately pulled out my phone and reread the message. Leave now. Don't say anything to her. Whatever it meant, it sounded serious. I tried to call back the number from which the message had come, but all I heard in response was an automated subscriber temporarily unavailable. There were muffled voices coming from the kitchen. Hamish and Ottilia were obviously arguing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was sharp, tense. Something was going on, and it was more serious than the usual family quarrel. My heart beat faster. My intuition screamed to leave immediately, to follow the warning of an unknown well-wisher. But the other part of me, the paternal part, didn't want to leave Ottilia alone with Hamish, especially if he really was involved in something illegal. I was faced with an impossible choice: trust the cryptic message and leave, or stay and try to protect my daughter from something I didn't even have a clear idea about. The voices in the kitchen grew louder, and suddenly I heard a sound like breaking glass, followed by a muffled shriek from Ottilia. That settled the matter. I got up quickly and headed for the kitchen. Hamish was standing by the broken glass, the shards of which glittered on the floor. Ottilia, pale and tense, leaned against the countertop, her hands trembling. "What's going on here?" I asked, shifting my gaze from my daughter to my son-in-law. "Nothing," Hamish replied, smiling strainedly. "Just a little clumsiness on my part." The glass slipped out of my hand. I glanced at Ottilia, looking for confirmation of that theory, but she avoided my gaze. "I have to go," I said firmly. "There have been unforeseen circumstances." "Now," Ottilia finally looked up at me. "But we haven't even served dessert yet, and Hamish wanted to discuss with you that matter of—" "Another time," I interrupted her, feeling every second of delay magnifying the invisible danger the message warned of. "I really have to go." Hamish studied me carefully, his eyes narrowed. "Is something wrong, Alistair?" he asked, and there was a strange note in his voice, something between suspicion and fear. "Have you gotten any news?" I realized he was guessing at the message. Maybe he even knew who had sent it. That thought only reinforced my decision to leave as soon as possible. "It's no big deal," I lied as casually as possible. I'd just forgotten that I'd promised to help my neighbor with his computer. "He's leaving early in the morning, so it can't wait." "Thursday night?" Hamish didn't hide his disbelief. "And it's so urgent that you're willing to leave in the middle of dinner?" "The neighbors have helped me many times when I've needed help," I replied, heading for the hallway. "I can't refuse them." Ottilia followed me, her face a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Daddy, this is ridiculous," she said as I started to put on my coat. "You've never left like this before, all of a sudden. What's really going on?" I looked at my daughter, so beautiful and so far away from me. She stood in her perfect house, in her perfect dress, with her perfect hair, and I suddenly felt a sharp longing for that little girl with the pigtails who had once looked at me with adoration. "Nothing's going on, Ottilia," I said softly. "It's just that I have to go. I'll call you tomorrow." "You always say that." Her voice shook with barely contained rage. "Always running away when things get hard. When you have to make decisions, take responsibility. You ran away when Mom was dying. You ran away when I needed you after she died. And now you're running away again." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I never ran away from Lorraine during her illness. On the contrary, I was there every minute, sleeping in a chair by her hospital bed, holding her hand until her last breath. And I tried to support Ottilia after her mother's death, but she pushed away every attempt, shut down in her grief, not allowing anyone to come near. "That's not true," I said quietly. "But now is not the time for this conversation. I really have to go." Hamish appeared in the hallway, his face tense. "Alistair, I insist that you stay," he said, and his voice was not a plea, but a demand. "We need to finish our conversation about the house." I buttoned my coat and picked up my umbrella. "Another time, Hamish. Right now I have to go." I turned toward the door, but my son-in-law was suddenly between me and the exit. "You have received some information." It was not a question, but a statement. "Someone has contacted you." "Who?" I saw something in his eyes that made me go cold, a mixture of fear and rage, a dangerous combination. In that moment, I realized that the unknown sender of the message was right. I needed to leave, and leave now. "No one contacted me." I tried to keep my voice calm and confident. "Now please, let me pass." Hamish hesitated, his eyes darting between me and Ottilia, who was watching us with growing concern. Hamish, she said uncertainly, what's going on? Why won't you let Daddy go? My brother-in-law seemed to come to his senses. He smiled strainedly and stepped aside. Of course I apologize, he said with fake cordiality. I was just upset that our conversation about the house had been postponed again. But if Alistair has to go, who am I to hold him back? I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to leave without further explanation. Goodbye, Ottilia, I said, opening the door. I'll call you tomorrow. My daughter didn't answer, only turned away, showing her displeasure. The last thing I saw before I closed the door behind me was Hamish's face, tense with eyes full of suspicion and hidden anger. Once outside, I took a deep breath of the damp evening air. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk still glistened with moisture, reflecting the light of the street lamps. I walked quickly away from the bird whistle house without looking back. When I'd gotten a decent distance away, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Denby's number. Alistair? My friend's voice sounded concerned. Are you okay? Yeah, I answered, continuing to walk briskly. But I got a strange message during dinner at Ottilia's. Someone warned me to leave immediately. There was silence on the other end of the wire. Did you leave? Denby finally asked. Yes, just now. What's going on, Denby? What's Hamish involved in? Not on the phone, he answered quietly. Where are you now? I looked around trying to get my bearings. About a block from their house, walking toward downtown. Good, Denby sounded relieved. Keep moving. I'll pick you up in 5 minutes at the corner of Oak and River. Denby, I stopped, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. Is Ottilia in danger? My friend paused, and that silence told me more than any words could. Just keep walking, Alistair, he said at last. Everything will be all right. He disconnected, leaving me with a lot of questions and growing anxiety. I quickened my step, heading toward the indicated intersection. Evening Wheaton was quiet and peaceful, the occasional passerby hurrying about their business, paying no attention to me. No one knew that in those moments my life, so measured and predictable in the morning, was being turned upside down. I had almost reached the corner of Dubovaya and Reknaya when I heard the sound of sirens behind me. When I turned around, I saw 3 police cars speeding toward the bird whistle house, their blinkers painting the street an ominous red and blue. My heart clenched. Whatever Hamish had done, payback was coming, and Ottilia was at the center of this storm. My instinct screamed to turn around and run back, to protect my daughter, to be there for her in this difficult moment. But my mind told me that there was nothing I could do to help her now, only cause more trouble with my presence. I was standing at the intersection, torn by conflicting feelings, when Denby's familiar car pulled up next to me. He opened the passenger door. Get in, he said briefly. Hurry up. I took one last look in the direction where the police cars had disappeared, then got into the car. Denby was out of the car before I could close the door. What's going on? I asked, buckling my seatbelt. Why are the police going to Ottilia's house? Denby gripped the steering wheel tighter, his profile looking hard, determined in the dim light of the dashboard. They have a search warrant, he answered, and for the arrest of Hamish Birdwhistle. Denby drove in silence, staring intently at the road. I sat beside him, digesting his words. Hamish's arrest, the search warrant. The phrases sounded like they were from some crime show, not events from my own life. And yet it was happening. Where are we going? I asked, breaking the heavy silence. To my house, Denby answered, keeping his eyes on the road. It's safe there, and we can talk in peace. I nodded, though my friend didn't see it. My whole mind was occupied with thoughts of Ottilia. How is she now? What's going on in her house? Had Hamish been arrested yet? Denby, I began cautiously, what will happen to my daughter? My friend gave me a quick glance, then focused back on the road. If she's not involved in her husband's affairs, nothing, he answered. She'll be questioned, of course, but if she didn't know about his machinations, there shouldn't be a problem. If, that little word hung between us, full of doubt and anxiety. Did Ottilia know what her husband was up to? Was she an accomplice, or as much a victim of deception as the rest of us? Denby's house was on the outskirts of Wheaton, a quiet neighborhood inhabited mostly by retirees and young families who couldn't afford property in the more upscale parts of town. The modest one-story cottage with its small garden was the opposite of the Birdwhistle's luxurious dwelling, but it had a homey atmosphere that was missing from the perfectly furnished rooms of my daughter's house. Denby led me into the living room, which was a creative mess, with books on the shelves and coffee table, a few file folders, and a stack of newspapers. On the wall were pictures. Denby and his wife, who had died of cancer the year before Lorraine died, Denby and his children and grandchildren, some old pictures of him and me as young, hopeful, and ambitious. "Sit down," Denby said, pointing to the worn but cozy couch. Will you have a drink? I've got whiskey." "Yeah, I guess so," I agreed. "I could use one after tonight." While he fiddled in the kitchen, I tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't know where to start when Denby got back. What exactly had Hamish done? How long had he been followed? And most importantly, who had sent me that warning? Denby returned with 2 glasses of whiskey and sat down in the chair opposite me. "Before you start asking questions," he said, handing me a glass, "let me get something straight. A lot of what I'm going to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation. Technically, I'm not supposed to discuss it with civilians." I nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. "I won't say anything to anyone, Denby. You know me." He smiled weakly. "Yes, I do. That's why I decided to break protocol. You deserve to know the truth, especially since Hamish tried to drag you into his dirty business." Those words confirmed my worst fears. I took a large sip of whiskey, feeling the liquid burn my throat. "So you're the one who sent me that message?" I asked. Denby shook his head. "No, I didn't, but I have a hunch who it might have been. We have an informant inside Hamish's circle. Apparently, he decided to warn you when he heard that an arrest was planned for today." "An informant?" I was puzzled. "So this isn't just some petty financial fraud? It sounds more serious." "Much more serious," Denby confirmed, his face grim. "Hamish Birdwhistle ran a whole network of corruption in the city administration. We've been following him for over a year, gathering evidence. Today we finally got all the warrants we needed." I leaned back on the couch, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. The Hamish I'd known for 15 years, my daughter's husband, had turned out to be corrupt, perhaps even criminal. And all this time he had been living a double life right under our noses. "In what way did he want to implicate me?" I asked, remembering our conversation about selling the house. Denby sipped his whiskey before answering. "One of his schemes involved illegally reselling city land at low prices to shell companies, who then resold it to developers at market value. The difference was pocketed by Hamish and his associates." "And my house? What's that got to do with it?" "Your house is in an area of special interest to developers. Hamish planned to buy it from you at an undervalued price using his position and insider knowledge of the city's plans. He would then resell the land for a huge profit." I remembered how insistent Hamish had been in trying to convince me to sell the house, how he'd shown me some charts and graphs promising a favorable deal. "But how could that make me an accessory?" I asked, still not understanding the full picture. Denby leaned forward, his eyes serious. "The thing is, Hamish had prepared documents that made you the formal owner of one of his shell companies. He planned to formalize the deal so that if you got in trouble with the law, all trails would lead back to you. You would be the perfect scapegoat. An elderly man with no knowledge of business who could claim he was just signing papers without understanding them." This information stunned me. I remembered the folder of documents that Hamish had so hastily hidden from my eyes. Deed of transfer of title, now I realized what it really was. "Oh my God," I muttered. "And he was willing to set me up. His wife's father?" "Nothing is sacred to people like Hamish when it comes to money and saving his own skin," Denby said bitterly. As soon as he realized the investigation was coming to a close, he started covering his tracks and looking for potential scapegoats. I sat there, shocked by the magnitude of the betrayal. All these years I'd tried to find common ground with Hamish for Ottilia's sake, tolerated his condescending attitude, his barely concealed contempt. And all the while he planned to use me in his dirty schemes. And Ottilia, that question was the most painful to me. Did she know? Denby hesitated, and in that pause I read the answer before he said it aloud. "We have no direct evidence of her involvement," he said carefully. "But considering how close she and Hamish are, and the fact that she helped organize your meeting today, it's hard to believe she was completely in the dark." I closed my eyes, feeling a heaviness building up inside. Was my own daughter really willing to sacrifice me for her own well-being? Was her alienation and coldness all these years not just the result of a complicated father-child relationship, but part of a more sinister plan? I don't want to believe that, I said quietly. Despite our differences, she's still my daughter. Denby put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support. I understand, Alistair, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she really didn't know what her husband was involved in. Either way, she will now have to go through interrogations and possibly trials if it turns out she was complicit. The thought that Attilia might end up in a courtroom, perhaps even jail, was unbearable. Despite all her barbs and coldness, I still loved her, still saw her as the little girl I had once rocked on my lap. What can I do? I asked, feeling utterly helpless. Now? Nothing, Denby replied. The police are doing their job. You'd better stay out of this, at least until we understand the full scope of the situation. I nodded, though every cell in my body protested against inaction. I wanted to run to Attilia, to make sure she was okay, to protect her even if she didn't deserve it. Denby, as if reading my thoughts, shook his head. Don't do anything stupid, Alistair. You're not helping Attilia now. You'll only hurt yourself. I know, I sighed. It's hard to realize that your own family could be involved in something so dirty. Dirty. My friend nodded understandingly. Corruption corrodes not only city structures, but also human souls. Hamish wasn't always like this. I remember his first years in the administration. Ambitious, yes, but with certain principles. Then money and power did their thing. We sat in silence for a while, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Outside the window it was completely dark, and only the street lamps cast a dim light on the rain-wet street. Somewhere in the distance the sirens wailed again, reminding me that at this moment my daughter's life was falling apart. Can I stay at your place tonight? I finally asked. I don't want to go home right now. Of course, Denby stood up. I have a spare room. It's not the most comfortable, but it's okay. I nodded gratefully. The thought of returning to an empty house, full of memories and silence, was unbearable at this point. The rest of the evening passed in muted conversations about the old days, about our youth, about everything that had happened before life had become so complicated and confusing. Denby didn't mention Hamish or the investigation again, for which I was grateful. I needed this respite, this illusion of normalcy, before facing the harsh reality again. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning on the uncomfortable bed in Denby's guest room. Thoughts of my daughter kept me awake. How was she feeling now? Had Hamish been arrested? Had she been interrogated? And most importantly, did she know about her husband's plans to frame me? The morning came gray and dank, as a fall day in Wheaton should. I got up early, feeling wrecked from a sleepless night. Denby was already in the kitchen making coffee. How did you sleep? Whoa, he asked, though the answer was obvious from my exhausted look. Not so good, I admitted, sitting down at the kitchen table. I'd been thinking about Attilia all night. Denby set a cup of strong black coffee in front of me. I called the office early this morning. Hamish has been arrested, charged with corruption, fraud, and abuse of office. Attilia was being questioned as a witness, but no charges had been filed against her yet. I was slightly relieved by this news. At least my daughter is not behind bars, at least not yet. I need to talk to her, I said, taking a sip of hot coffee. See how she's doing. Denby looked at me questioningly. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Alistair. She might not in the best mood to talk to you. She's my daughter, Denby. I met his gaze. No matter what happens, no matter what she's done, I can't just turn my back on her. My friend sighed, admitting defeat. Okay, but be prepared for the conversation to be difficult. Attilia probably knows that you left their house shortly before the police arrived. She may draw her own conclusions. I nodded, realizing the justice of his concerns. Indeed, my sudden departure, followed so quickly by Hamish's arrest, might look suspicious. Attilia might well have thought that I knew of the impending arrest and had run away without warning them. After breakfast, Denby drove me home. I was grateful for his support, for breaking protocol to tell me the truth, for providing a roof over my head in my time of need. I didn't have many friends like Denby Miracle. In fact, he was the only one. At home, the first thing I did was to call Attilia. The phone rang for a long time, but there was no answer. I tried again an hour later, then another, with the same result. She either didn't want to talk to me or was so busy dealing with the police that she couldn't answer. Either way, my concern for my daughter grew with each passing hour. By noon, I decided to act more decisively. If the mountain doesn't go to Muhammad, Muhammad goes to the mountain. I hailed a cab and drove to the bird whistle house, hoping that Ottilia was there and that she would agree to talk to me. As I approached the familiar street, I noticed that there was still a police car outside their house. Apparently the search was still going on, or they had left an officer on duty to keep watch. Either way, it complicated my plans. I asked the cab driver to stop around the corner from the house and walk the remaining distance. As I got closer, I saw Ottilia coming out of the house, accompanied by a policeman. She looked haggard. Her face was pale, her eyes reddened with tears. My heart squeezed at the sight of her suffering. "Ottilia," I called out, quickening my step. She turned at my voice and her expression changed instantly. Weariness and grief were replaced by icy fury. "You!" She took a step toward me, her hands clenched into fists. "How dare you show up here? After what you did?" I stopped, stunned by the force of her anger. "Ottilia, I don't understand." "You don't understand." Her voice shook with rage. You knew the police were coming and you didn't warn us. You ran away to save your own skin, and you left us to our own devices." The policeman standing next to her looked awkward, as if he had accidentally witnessed a family quarrel. "That's not true," I said quietly, trying to remain calm. "I got a warning from an unknown number. I didn't know what was going to happen." "You're lying." Ottilia was almost screaming now. "You've always lied, all my life. You said you loved my mom and me, but you were never there for us when we needed you. And now you betrayed your family again." Her words hurt deeper than any physical blow, especially because they were unfair. I never betrayed Lorraine or Ottilie. I've always tried to be a good husband and father, even if not always successfully. "Ottilia, listen to me." I took a step toward her, but she backed away as if I was contagious. "I didn't know about Hamish's arrest until last night. I got the message from someone who wanted to keep me out of trouble. I didn't betray you." "What about the fact that your friend Denby Miracle is leading the investigation against Hamish?" Her eyes narrowed. "Are you saying it's just a coincidence?" I was stunned. I didn't know Denby was leading the investigation. He hadn't mentioned it once. "I didn't know," I said honestly. "Denby hadn't told me anything until last night." "Another lie!" Ottilia shook her head. "You and he must have planned the whole thing, maybe even fabricated these accusations against Hamish. You've always hated him, always envied his success, his position in society. The absurdity of these accusations might have made me laugh if the situation had not been so tragic. I, a humble pensioner, a former postal clerk, suddenly turned into a conspirator manipulating the prosecutor's office for a personal vendetta. "Ottilia, you realize this doesn't make sense," I said as gently as I could. "I don't have the power or influence to organize something like that, and I would never harm you, even if I could." She looked at me with such contempt that it physically hurt. "Son of Thorn, don't come near me again," she said quietly but firmly. "I don't think of you as my father anymore." With those words, she turned to the policeman. "Can we go now? I don't want to be around that man anymore." The officer nodded, giving me a sympathetic look, and they walked together toward the police car. The last thing I saw before they drove away was Attilia's face, turned away from me in profile, with an expression of such absolute hatred that I knew it was the end. The end of our relationship, the end of any hope of reconciliation. I stood on the sidewalk watching the car drive away, feeling something inside me finally break. The daughter I loved against all odds had just cut me out of her life. And the worst part was that part of me felt relieved by this breakup, by the release from the weight of our toxic relationship. Slowly, as if I had aged another 10 years in those few minutes, I wandered toward home, on foot, without hailing a cab. I needed time to process everything that had happened, to come to terms with a loss that, ironically, was long overdue. When I finally reached my old house, the only place I'd ever felt truly at home, the sun was already beginning to set. I sat on the porch without going inside and let the tears I'd been holding back since the moment I'd seen the hatred in Ottilia's eyes finally spill over. I mourned not only the loss of my daughter, but also the end of the illusion I had cherished all these years. The illusion that somewhere deep inside that cold, calculating woman still lived the little girl who had once loved her daddy. Now I knew the truth. That little girl was gone. And maybe she had been gone for a long time. It had been a week since the day my life had been turned upside down. Hamish Birdwhistle, my son-in-law, was at the center of a major corruption scandal. The local papers were full of headlines. High-ranking city official arrested on corruption charges. Birdwhistle scheme, how Wheaton taxpayers were cheated. Case of illegal resale of city land gains momentum. I tried not to read these articles, but they were everywhere. At the library where I continued to volunteer, it was all visitors talked about. In the supermarket, in the pharmacy, in the pub, everywhere I went, people were discussing the Birdwhistle affair, not knowing that I had anything to do with it. Denby kept me informed about the official part of the investigation. Hamish was in custody, charged with several counts including corruption, fraud, abuse of office, and even money laundering. He faced up to 15 years in prison. "What about Attilia?" I asked Denby during our meeting in his office just outside the courthouse. My friend sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, a gesture I'd known since childhood. "It's what he always did when he was tired or worried." "Officially, she's being held as a witness," he replied. "We found no direct evidence of her involvement in her husband's schemes, but she's adamantly refusing to cooperate with the investigation, claiming it's all political persecution and a witch hunt." I nodded, unsurprised by this turn of events. Attilia had always been stubborn. Even as a child, when she knew she was wrong, she would have bitten her tongue off rather than admit she was wrong. "Had she contacted you?" Denby asked, watching my reaction carefully. "No," I shook my head. "Not a word after we met at their house. She'd made it clear she didn't want to see me." "Give her time," Denby tried to comfort me. "She's in shock right now, angry at the world. When things settle down, maybe she'll realize that you had nothing to do with Hamish's arrest." I only smiled weakly in response. I knew deep down that Attilia wouldn't change her mind. It was easier for her to accuse me than to admit that her husband was the culprit, and she had either turned a blind eye or been complicit. The days dragged on, adding up to weeks. Life in Wheaton was slowly returning to normal, though the Hamish scandal was still the main topic of discussion. I tried to stay out of it all, focusing on my daily routine. Working in the library, walking in the park, reading books, simple pleasures that always brought me comfort. One morning, going through the mail, I found a letter from Hamish's attorney. It informed me that my son-in-law was still pushing to sell my house, claiming that we had supposedly made a verbal agreement during our last dinner. I handed the letter to Denby, who assured me that these were empty threats. Without a written contract, Hamish had no claim to my property, especially now that he was under investigation. "He's just trying to find money for lawyers," Denby explained. "All his accounts are frozen, his assets are seized. He's desperate." I understood that desperation, but I had no sympathy. Hamish had made his choice, choosing the path of deceit and corruption. What's more, he was willing to frame me, to make me a scapegoat for his dirty deeds. That's unforgivable. But what really hurt was Attilia's silence. No call, no message, no letter. It was as if I no longer existed for her. In the first few days after Hamish's arrest, I had expected her to contact me, if only to vent her anger. But she chose a complete breakup, an absolute rejection. A month after Hamish's arrest, I ran into Attilia by chance at the supermarket. She was standing in the fruit section, examining apples with a look of concentration, as if the fate of the world depended on it. I immediately noticed the change in her appearance. She had lost weight, her features had sharpened, and shadows had fallen under her eyes. The elegant hairstyle she'd always been so proud of had been replaced by a simple ponytail, and her expensive clothes by jeans and a simple sweater. My heart squeezed at the sight of her. Despite all the hurt, all the words that couldn't be taken back, she was still my daughter, my flesh and blood. I wanted to approach her, to ask her how she was doing, to offer help. But no sooner had I taken a step than Attilia looked up and saw me. For a moment, her face showed a whole range of emotions: surprise, pain, anger, and something else I couldn't recognize. Then she just turned and walked away, leaving the shopping cart right on the floor, without even taking a second look at me. That moment was a turning point for me. I realized that to cling to the hope of reconciliation was to condemn myself to endless pain. Ottilia had made her choice, and I had to honor it, even if it broke my heart. That night I sat in my old chair, looking at the photographs I had kept all these years. Ottilia as a child, laughing, pigtailed, with chocolate on her cheeks. Ottilia as a teenager, already more serious but still with a spark in her eyes. Ottilia on her wedding day, cold, flawless, beautiful, and so foreign. I took the oldest photo, Lorraine holding newborn Ottilia in her arms, and me standing next to her, so young, so proud, so naively happy. We were a family then, a real family. When and how did it all go wrong? Perhaps it was my job, which was taking up too much of my time, not allowing enough attention to my daughter. Or the fact that Lorraine and I sometimes argued about our parenting methods. She was stricter, I was gentler. Or the fact that Ottilia always felt that my wife and I wanted a son, but had a girl, which wasn't true. We were happy with any child. Or maybe it wasn't about us at all. Maybe Ottilia was just born that way. Cold, calculating, incapable of real affection. The thought was too painful to dwell on for long. I gathered up all the pictures and put them in a box, which I took to the attic. I didn't throw them away. I wasn't ready for such a permanent breakup, but I put them out of sight. It was time to start a new chapter of life, without the shadow of the constant feelings of guilt and failure that had haunted me all the years of my relationship with Ottilia. I spent the next few weeks doing what psychologists call self-work. I started walking more, reading books not just out of habit but with real interest. Started taking art classes at the local community center, something I had long dreamed of doing but never found the time or determination to do. It was at these courses that I met Cassie Ellington, a widow about my age, with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. She had moved to Wheaton after her husband's death to be closer to her son and grandchildren. We turned out to have a lot in common: a love of old movies, classic literature, long walks, and most importantly, an understanding of what it means to lose a loved one, to be alone in the second half of life. We were in no hurry. Our relationship developed slowly, cautiously. First, cups of tea together after class, then walks in the park, visits to the local movie theater, where they showed a retrospective of Hitchcock films. Cassie wasn't trying to replace Lorraine, and I wasn't looking for a new wife in her. We were just two lonely people who found solace in each other's company. Hamish's trial began 3 months after his arrest. I hadn't followed the trial specifically, but the news was everywhere. According to rumors, the prosecutor's office had gathered irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Denby, who now rarely spoke to me about the case, only confirmed that the prosecution had an ironclad case. One evening on my way home from a meeting with Cassie, I noticed a familiar figure near my porch. Ottilia. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself as if protecting herself from the cold. Even though the evening was warm, when she turned toward me, I saw that she had been crying. Her eyes were red, her makeup smeared. Ottilia? I stopped a few steps away from her, not knowing what to expect. "What are you doing here?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. "I need to talk to you." Her voice sounded hoarse, like she'd been screaming or crying for a long time. "Can I come in?" I opened the door silently and let her in. We walked into the living room, where Ottilia sat on the edge of the couch, her back straight, as tense and collected as ever, despite her obvious emotional state. "Tea? Coffee?" I offered, unsure how to start the conversation. "No need for anything." She shook her head. I'm here on business." Of course, Ottilia never came just to see me. There was always some business. "I'm listening," I said, sitting down in the chair across from her. She stared at her hands for a long moment, then looked up, her eyes a mixture of desperation and determination. "Hamish's lawyers say he's facing up to 15 years, she began, unless we can find the money for bail and a better defense." I didn't say anything, already guessing where she was going with this. "All our accounts are frozen, our house is in foreclosure, our cars have been repossessed," Ottilia continued. "I have nothing left. I'm living with a friend, barely making ends meet." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. Despite everything, I didn't want my daughter to suffer. "It's not about pity," her voice became harsher. "I need money. A lot of money, and you have it. I looked at her in bewilderment. I do? Ottilia, I live on my pension. What money? Your house, she said as if it were obvious. It's worth a lot of money, especially now that real estate prices in the center are rising. If you sell it, we can hire the best lawyers for Hamish. I couldn't believe my ears. After everything that happened, after Hamish tried to swindle me out of my house to use me in his dirty schemes, Ottilia comes and asks me to sell this same house to help him get away with it. Do you realize what you are asking for? I asked quietly. This house is all I have, all my memories of your mother, of our family. And you want me to sell it to help a man who tried to frame me? He wasn't trying to frame you, Ottilia exclaimed. It's all made up by the prosecutor's office. Hamish is innocent. He was framed by his political enemies. Ottilia, I tried to speak calmly, although inside I was boiling with anger. The prosecutor's office has proof. Documents, testimonies, recordings of negotiations. Hamish is guilty, and you know it. I don't know anything. She jumped to her feet. All I know is that my husband is in prison and my father refuses to help him. Help him? Now I'm up too. Ottilia, this man stole millions from the city budget. He's been cheating the taxpayers for years, and he was willing to frame me to save his own skin. You always hated him, she shouted, her face contorted with rage. Oh no, always jealous of his success, his position. You never liked that I married him, that I chose a better life than you could give me. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. Not because they were true. I had never been jealous of Hamish, never wished him harm. I just wanted my daughter to be happy. But in her warped perception, I was always the loser, the disappointment, the man who couldn't give her what she deserved. I'm not selling the house, Ottilia, I said firmly. Not to help a criminal escape the punishment he deserved. Not even for the sake of your own daughter? Her voice trembled. Even if I say it's the only way to save my life. Your life doesn't depend on whether Hamish goes to jail or not, I replied. You can start over. You're young. You have a profession. I can what? She interrupted. Go back to teaching music to kids for a pittance? Live in a tiny apartment? Forget all your plans, your dreams, your ambitions. Is that what you want for your daughter? I looked at her and saw not a grown woman, but a cranky child who didn't get the toy she wanted. Ottilia had always been like that, always wanting more, better, more expensive, and she was never grateful for what she already had. I want you to be happy, Ottilia, I said sincerely, but not at the expense of my house, and not at the expense of perverting justice. Hamish committed a crime, and he must answer for it. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the last hope dying in her eyes. Then she straightened and lifted her chin, a gesture I knew from her childhood, a sign of unassailable pride. So this is your last word? She asked coldly. Yes, I answered firmly. I will not sell the house. Ottilia nodded, as if she had received confirmation of something she had known for a long time. Then we have nothing more to talk about, she said, heading for the door. Goodbye, Alistair. I hope you will be happy in your precious home. Alone. She said the last word like a curse, like the worst fate one could wish on a man. But for me, loneliness stopped being frightening a long time ago. I learned to find not only peace and quiet in it, but also freedom. Freedom from manipulation, from toxic relationships, from the constant feelings of guilt and inadequacy. Goodbye, Ottilia, I said when she was already at the door. I will always love you, no matter what. She didn't turn around, didn't answer. She just walked out, slamming the door loudly, as if once again emphasizing the finality of our breakup. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling a strange mixture of bitterness and relief. Bitterness at the loss of a daughter who, despite our differences, I still loved. And relief at the realization that I no longer had to live in constant tension, waiting for the next blow, the next disappointment. A week after Ottilia's visit, I received a letter from her lawyer. It contained a formal request for financial assistance for a daughter who was said to be in distress due to circumstances beyond her control. Attached to the letter was documentation of a lawsuit against me demanding child support payments. I showed the letter to Denby, who only shook his head with a bitter chuckle. Ottilia was always stubborn, he said, but this This is desperate. Child support for an adult daughter who has abandoned her relationship with her father? Any judge would dismiss such a claim immediately. I nodded, realizing that. But the very fact that Attilia was willing to go to such lengths spoke volumes. Her character, her priorities, how little our family ties meant to her compared to money and status. I left the letter unanswered, not out of revenge or resentment, but because I realized that any response would be used against me, twisted, turned into further proof of my inadequacy as a father. Hamish's trial ended with a guilty verdict, 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 8. Attilia, according to Denby, attended the reading of the verdict, held herself with icy dignity, and left the courtroom without shedding a tear. I didn't know how she felt at that moment. Perhaps deep inside she realized her husband's guilt, understood the justice of the punishment. Or perhaps she really believed in his innocence, in conspiracy theories, in political intrigue. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Not to me, not to our future. Life went on. I spent more and more time with Cassie, our relationship deepening, moving from simple friendship to something more meaningful. We didn't rush to put a name to it, didn't rush through the formalities. We were good together, and that was enough. I started traveling, small trips around the neighborhood, sometimes with Cassie, sometimes alone, discovering places I'd always wanted to visit, but had put off for later, for when I finished working, when Attilia grew up, when. There were always reasons to put life off until tomorrow. Now I realize that tomorrow might not come. That life should be lived today, now, without postponing happiness for an uncertain future. One spring day, almost a year after Hamish's arrest, I received another letter from Attilia, this time not through a lawyer, but written in her own hand. The handwriting I knew so well was nervous, uneven, as if her hand had been shaking as she wrote. "Daddy," it began, and this address, which I hadn't heard from her in so long, made my heart clench. "I'm desperate. Money has run out. I can't find work. Everywhere refuses as soon as they find out I'm Hamish's wife. The house has been confiscated. There's nowhere to live. I beg you to help me. I know I don't deserve your help after all I've said and done, but you're my father, and you're the only one who can help me now." What followed were details of her financial problems, mentions of debt, possible eviction from her rented apartment, and health problems due to constant stress. The letter ended with a request for money, a specific amount that Attilia said would help her get back on her feet and start over. I reread the letter several times, trying to see the sincere remorse behind the words, the real need to be reunited. But all I saw was another attempt at manipulation, another play on my father's feelings for financial gain. Maybe I was wrong. Perhaps Attilia really had rethought her life, really needed not only money, but my support, my presence. But after so many years of deceit, of coldness, of calculated exploitation of our kinship ties, I could no longer believe in the sincerity of her words. I put the letter in my desk drawer and left it unanswered. Not out of revenge, not out of a desire to hurt, but out of a realization that some relationships simply cannot be repaired, that some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. That night I sat on the porch of my house for a long time, watching the sunset. The house I had so stubbornly refused to sell had become not just a refuge for me, but a symbol of freedom. Freedom from toxic relationships, from manipulation, from constant guilt. I thought about Lorraine, about what she would say about my decision. Would she have approved of my refusal to help my daughter? Or would she call for forgiveness for another attempt at a relationship? I didn't know the answer. But I did know that Lorraine had always wanted me to be happy, to live my life to the fullest, even after she was gone. And for the first time in years, I felt I was approaching that state, not perfect happiness, but a quiet acceptance of life as it was, with all its light and dark sides. Attilia's letter remained unanswered. Sometimes, in rare moments of weakness, I thought about calling her, to find out how she was coping, to offer, if not money, then at least moral support. But each time something stopped me. Maybe it was my instinct for self-preservation. Maybe it was the memory of all the previous disappointments. Life went on as it was. Without Attilia, without Hamish, without the constant feelings of guilt and inadequacy that had haunted me all the years of my relationship with my daughter. And in this new life, so different from anything I had known before, I was finally beginning to find peace.